Welcome to this explainer. If you've been paying attention to the supply chain sector lately, you know we're at an absolute tipping point right now. I mean, the era of just throwing more human labor at warehouse problems, that's completely over. Mathematically, practically, it just doesn't work anymore. So today, we're diving straight into the source material to unpack the hard financial models, the implementation frameworks, and the exact ROI that makes spatial robotics, honestly, a mandatory upgrade for operations this year. Okay, here's our agenda for today. We'll hit 1. The logistics labor crisis. 2. What is spatial robotics? 3. Calculating the automation ROI. 4. Navigating implementation challenges. 5. Empowering the human workforce. And finally, 6. The 2026 market landscape. Let's jump right in. Section 1. The logistics labor crisis. The multi-million-dollar cost of manual operations. We really have to begin by anchoring ourselves in the visceral, financial reality of current supply chain inefficiencies. The old manual way of doing things isn't just slow anymore, it's actively draining capital. $2.1 million. Let that sink in for a second. That staggering figure represents the annual loss companies face per warehouse simply due to inefficient manual processes. And this isn't some exaggeration, it's the baseline bleed when your operations rely on legacy workflows. But the bleeding doesn't actually stop there. When we look at the compounding hidden costs of doing things manually, we aren't just talking about slow walking speeds. No, we're talking about $450,000 burned on recruitment and training, which is driven by a frankly shocking 68% worker turnover rate. And when your throughput is artificially capped at maybe 80 to 120 picks per hour, and your error rate is sitting around 3 to 5%, you're leaking $250,000 a year just in mistakes. It's literally like carrying water in a bucket full of holes. Add in the fact that 89% of warehouses are reporting critical staffing shortages right now, and you quickly realize the manual labor pool simply cannot support modern fulfillment demands anymore. Let's look at the historical context to see how this all builds, because this definitely didn't happen overnight. We can actually trace this evolution back to 2015 when Amazon dropped $775 million on Kiva systems, which really validated the entire market. Then fast forward to 2020, COVID-19 hits, causing a massive 300% spike in automation adoption out of pure sheer necessity. By 2022, a critical technological milestone was reached when SLAM technology hit 99.9% accuracy. And well, that brings us to the massively leap we're seeing in 2026, where AI-powered spatial robotics aren't just a cool novelty, they're the absolute standard, driving an incredible 67% reduction in costs compared to those manual processes we just talked about. Moving on to Section 2, what is spatial robotics? Context-aware automation explained. The crucial point here is understanding what this tech actually is and why it's so fundamentally different from the clunky, rigid robots we've seen in the past. So here's the definitive breakdown. Spatial robotics involves autonomous systems that use spatial awareness and context-aware AI. But what really stood out in the research is how SLAM, that's simultaneous localization and mapping, actually works in practice. It isn't just a basic static map drawn on a computer screen. It's the technology that lets the robot understand its world in real time. Paired with edge computing for instant, low-latency decision-making, these robots dynamically navigate physical spaces. They avoid obstacles, they dodge humans, they adapt to changing environments on the fly, all without needing some pre-programmed track taped to the floor. When we compare the two paradigms directly, the massive jump is just undeniable. We take that manual baseline of 120 picks an hour with a 5% error rate, and we replace it with context-aware automation. The result? A massive 240% increase in throughput and a 97% improvement in accuracy. Plus, because these robots are actually context-aware, they collaborate safely alongside your human workers. No more needing to cage them off in a separate zone like we used to. And listen, this isn't just marketing hype. Quoting directly from the source material, Dr. Daniela Russ, director at MIT CSAIL, states the future of context-aware robotics relies heavily on our advancements in autonomous systems and spatial AI. Industry leaders are validating that this exact leap in spatial computing is what makes these complex physical operations possible today. The AI has finally, truly caught up with the hardware, unlocking a completely new frontier in logistics. All right, Section 3, calculating the automation ROI. Financial modeling and shifting payback periods. CTOs love the tech, but CFOs, they need to justify a multi-million-dollar deployment. So let's look at the actual return on investment. Just look at how the average payback period has plummeted over time. Back in 2016, you were looking at up to 42, sometimes even 48 months to recoup your investment. Honestly, it was a really tough sell. But by 2020, that dropped to 30 months. And today, in 2026, the average payback period for these systems is an incredibly fast 18 months. For anyone modeling warehouse finances right now, that completely changes the game. However, to remain completely objective here, we've got to analyze the total cost of ownership, because it's not just about buying the hardware. When we break down the expense categories, the base robot might cost anywhere from $25,000 to $250,000, depending on payload and features. But you really have to factor in implementation, which can run $500,000. And don't forget those easily overlooked expenses: a $50,000 IT integration fee, a $40,000 annual maintenance fee, and $25,000 for staff training. You absolutely have to model all of this in to securely realize that rapid 18-month ROI. Which brings us to Section 4. Navigating implementation challenges, security, safety, and why integrations fail. Because despite those impressive ROI numbers, the reality is that 73% of robotics projects fail or stall out due to poor integration planning. One of the absolute biggest blind spots we see is data. Modern connected robots generate about 2.5 terabytes of data every single day. Yet, astonishingly, 34% of companies deploying these systems lack adequate cybersecurity. They're basically leaving connected data centers roaming freely around their physical warehouses. When you consider that the average data breach costs a devastating $4.45 million, well, skipping zero-trust architecture for your robot fleet is just a catastrophic financial risk. So, to avoid becoming a failure statistic, the sources outline a really clear 4-step implementation framework. First step, a strict infrastructure audit, taking about 2 to 3 weeks. Second, develop a phased rollout plan. Please don't try to automate the whole warehouse on day one. Third, use simulation tools to train your staff before the physical robots even arrive on site. And fourth, implement a robust change management program. Taking this structured approach allows companies to securely deploy these systems in just 4 to 8 weeks. Section 5. Empowering the human workforce. Overcoming 45% worker resistance. That fourth step we just mentioned, change management, brings us to a major hurdle you will undoubtedly face: workforce fear. Currently, fear of job displacement creates a 45% resistance to automation on the warehouse floor. But here's the really fascinating twist in the data. By treating automation as augmentation rather than replacement, companies are actually turning this weakness into a massive strength. Yes, it requires a pretty significant investment, about $8,000 to $25,000 in reskilling per employee, taking roughly 6 to 12 weeks to reach full proficiency. But the main takeaway here is the outcome. Companies are surprisingly boosting staff retention by 34%. It just proves that communication and upskilling completely trump fear. When you communicate clearly and give workers a concrete path to become robot operators or analysts, overall acceptance skyrockets to 78%. Section 6, the 2026 market landscape, avoiding vendor lock-in. Finally, let's explore the market itself, which is absolutely booming right now, but it's also crowded with over 234 active vendors, and that is creating some massive analysis paralysis for decision-makers. A crucial warning from the data is what experts are calling the vendor lock-in trap. Right now, 42% of rigid proprietary systems end up requiring expensive upgrades within just 24 months. Think about that. If you buy into a closed ecosystem and later decide you need to switch vendors because they can't scale with you, the switching costs can hit anywhere from $150,000 to $500,000 just in penalties and replaced hardware. Ouch! And this is exactly why the architectural approach matters just as much as the hardware itself. As authorities in scaling logistics point out, like Rick Walker, president of Amazon Robotics, the 2026 standard dictates that modular, API-first systems are an absolute necessity. His quote says it perfectly. Warehouse automation at scale teaches us that modular, open architecture systems are the only way to achieve long-term ROI. You simply cannot afford to buy a closed box anymore. So how do you actually protect your investment? Well, this 4-step framework is how smart decision makers are future-proofing their supply chains right now. Number 1, exclusively choose open architecture platforms. Number 2, rigorously verify API compatibility with your existing tech stack. Number 3, ensure your chosen vendor has a demonstrated, proven commitment to industry standards. And number 4, plan a 5-year technology roadmap, fully expecting that your needs are going to evolve rapidly. Which really brings us to the core of the issue today.
We've seen the data, we've broken down the ROI, and we've navigated the implementation pitfalls. I want to leave you with this final, critical thought based on everything we've just covered in this explainer. With manual inefficiencies bleeding $2.1 million annually per facility, how much is standing still ultimately costing your business right now? And honestly, is your supply chain truly ready for the demands of 2026?